Okay guys, so rather than watching me do the entire thing in real time, I'm going to do a voiceover and you can watch me do this sped up. It will take a lot less time. The whole process for me took about an hour. I've done this before a couple of times, but if it takes you longer, don't worry about that. One downside about watching people who work really quick like this is that you feel like you have to work this quick. No, no, slow down, take your time, go through the steps that we've gone through before, and you'll do just fine with working with this. So you can see this first part, I'm selecting each of the individual objects and I'm putting a silhouette on their own layer. Primarily, I'm using my quick selection tool, but every once in a while you'll see me swap over to the lasso tool, like what I'm doing right here, and I'm just cutting off any extra part that was difficult to unselect using that. I'm filling it in with just kind of a local color, each one having something a little bit different. And you can see I'm doing the grapes. There's the lasso tool, and I cut off the rest of that leaf. Even though it's a local color, one thing I try to challenge myself to do was to not look at the actual color. I know, for instance, those grapes, you can saw I made them very, very purple. This leaf isn't that green, but I tried to make it something that makes the color pop out just a little bit more. The hardest thing to do was this bit of glass down here. However, all I'm doing is looking at the shadow shapes and the highlight shapes and giving it its own local color and then working from there. Remember, you can hold down Control and click on your selection. That's what allows me to fill it in. I'm done using my picture. I don't want to have it in the background. Instead, I'm sticking it up in the top corner. Now I'm going to work on my background. Starting off with a good middle gray, I can turn on all of my different selections. You can see where things will be placed. And I'm just darkening it in. Remember, you also want to pay attention to the lights and darks within your composition. If your background is too dark, then your foreground is going to really pop out. But I want to have highlights and shadows. So on one side of my background, I want it to be nice and dark, and on another side, I want it to be lighter. You can see even in the background, it's nice and blue. It's a good variety of lights and darks. Really, I think I just used a large brush and did spotches. But I didn't keep it white. I didn't do exactly what's in the picture. So feel free to change it up. Now I'm going through and I've made a clipping mask on top of the bottle layer, and I'm adding in the colors and highlights and shades for it. When I first started doing this, I was real tempted to pull the colors directly from the picture. And if this is your first time doing this, feel free to do that. If it's too difficult picking out colors by eye, grab your eyedropper tool and select the area that you need and get that exact color. However, if you've got some experience doing painting, if you want to really challenge yourself to up how your eyes can see the world, try picking the colors on your own. Pull up your color picker, play around with the colors. You can see these highlights, they're not pure white. I've added a little bit of yellow to it. All of my shadows are tinted towards cooler colors, a little bit of red, a little bit of blue in it. You can see I'm even putting some reflections in the left side of that bottle. I know that there's a yellow and red pair off to that side, so I'm going to reflect some yellow and red on that side of the bottle as well. Another thing you'll notice, whenever I start laying down the colors, I'll start with a large brush. This allows me to lay in larger areas of color, then I'll swap over to a smaller brush and then do some little details. You never want to get too close to the image that you're working with. I never zoom in, I'm staying nice and far away. This allows me to look for large areas of color, not just having to work in small details. If you find yourself zooming in and trying to put every single little stroke on there and every little dot and detail, it's going to take you forever, and when you back away, your image isn't going to look very cohesive. Instead, zoom out a little bit, add little details as needed, but mainly look for the larger details. You can see on my pear, I added a lot of blue to that shadow. I added some lighter highlights to that particular area. If I had to do it again, I would go over the background and add a little bit of dark behind that pear, but I think it still worked out pretty well. Working one object at a time, don't want to get too rushed. Remember, you can move your reference photo around. The flower was the hardest thing for me to do, simply because there's so many small details. But again, if I just break it down into simple shapes, A lot of times I'm squinting my eye. I'm trying to see just what does it look like in a vague form. That helps out a lot. Here I am, I'm going to start getting a little bit bogged down trying to draw off the details. Later you'll see me swap over to a bigger brush, and then I'll paint in the larger areas, then come back to a smaller brush. There we go. Now I'm painting in a bigger brush and it's going a lot faster. Then I'll swap over to the smaller one, lay in the details, and it finishes up really, really well. Another thing is don't be afraid to add your highlights last. Start off with your darker shapes. Usually there's a lot more darker areas on or shadow areas on your objects. Put those in, and you'll find when you add your highlights last, it really starts to pop out. I'm even going back over my shadows and adding a little bit more of a blue or a little bit more of a purple tinge. That blue and purple will look really, really good once I start working on the grapes, because that has a lot of purple. When you play around with color, you don't have to use the same colors that you see in your photograph. Give it a little bit of fudging. It just makes it look more like a painting. And that's the goal of doing a painting. I've already got the photograph. If I wanted it to look exactly like that, then I would just use a photograph. I want mine to look like a painting. I want it to have a little bit of play in the details, a little bit of fudging on the shadows and the highlights. Same way for this apple. The apple in the shade, I'm going slightly blue, which is making it nice and purple. As far as the highlights, I'm picking up a little bit of yellow from the flower. I'm picking up a little bit of reds and maybe even a little greens. There we go, a little bit of green on that inner core. But that looks more like a painted apple than a real apple, and that's the effect that I'm going for. You can even see the underside of that apple. It's a little bit lighter. I'm trying to pick up some of that reflected light going into there. Here's another one that was kind of challenging for me. Originally, I wanted to draw off each individual grape. Then I said, no, just look at the entire, where does the dark shapes of the shadows fall in there? Once I start getting the larger shapes, now I can go back in and just add some small details of some highlights. Putting in some blue, I'll swap over to a lighter purple later. There we go, lighter blue. Make my brush smaller. Now I'm just touching the highlights. There wasn't a lot of details to work with from the photograph to begin with, so it's okay if this is a little bit darker. You can also see the arrangement of my composition. Even though it's centered, check out what's on that rule of thirds on the right-hand side. There's the bottle. Check out what's on the rule of thirds at the bottom half of my composition. There's the flower. Everything's overlapping. It's nice and cohesive. For this green leaf that I'm painting, I'm adding some red to the shadow side. This is pulling in some reds that you have in the apple and in the pear, and it's also a complementary of the green that we're working with. Now we're starting to get the smaller details of the cup. I'm pulling in some of the blues that you would see if it was sitting on a blue background. And all I'm looking for are lights and darks. I'm not looking for details. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm just saying, hey, there's a light area here, and I'm putting a light color down. There's a dark area here, I'm putting a dark color down. If you can get the values down for your project, everything will fall into place. That's kind of a big secret for any type of painting. I've swapped back into my background layer now. This time, rather than having the blue, I'm giving it a little bit of a red cast. And I forgot to add a little bit of detail for that right side of the cup. So now I made a new layer going on top of it, adding the highlight just for that one particular area. If you have some other areas in your entire composition that need a little bit of touch up, of course it's difficult to do that in a clipping mask. Just make another layer at the very top of your composition and then paint on top of that one. If you don't like it, hey, all you got to do is erase that layer and you haven't lost anything. Now that I've kind of reached a good finishing point, I've opened up my adjustments palette. Here I'm going to make the lights and darks really pop. I've added looks like a levels adjustment, and now I've added a gradient map. And I changed the blending mode of my gradient map to, looks like lighten color, lighten the color. And I'm just playing around with how that looked, and I gave it a much warmer tinge. If you back up, you can see how in one case it was very, very warm. Then I dropped the opacity down so it's a little bit lighter. So here you can see the final photograph, or the first photograph. Here's the final painting. And then the next one will be the painting with the colors slightly tweaked, and they're all come together. All right, good luck.